Abigail Horton had never been the type to romanticize isolation. Her life had been built in the structured cadence of research stations and agricultural zoning boards, not romantic cabins or untouched forests. And yet, when the letter arrived informing her of an inheritance left by her late uncle, an aging, self-sufficient cabin nestled in a remote valley in the Pacific Northwest, she didn't hesitate. It wasn't the kind of place people just stumbled upon. There was no cell reception, no nearby stores, not even a paved road beyond the first 5 miles. The valley had no name, only coordinates and a handful of faded land use permits dated back nearly a century. Her uncle, a quiet man of few words and strong principles, had spent the last 3 decades tending to the land, preserving it, maintaining it not as a wilderness getaway, but as a protected ecosystem that nobody else had much interest in touching. The paperwork was stunningly thorough. She wasn't just inheriting a piece of land. She was becoming the sole legal owner of an unincorporated 2,500-acre tract with its own water source, timber rights, and something that rarely existed anymore in the modern world: total autonomy. There were no easements, no shared access points, no grazing rights for neighboring properties. The land was its own world. Abigail had driven out 3 weeks after receiving the deed, her SUV loaded with basic supplies, a refurbished chainsaw, heavy-duty gloves, laminated maps, and 5 different sets of official documents just in case someone tried to contest her right to be there. She wasn't naive. She had worked long enough in land use disputes to know that legal clarity didn't always translate to local acceptance. Her arrival in the valley was quiet. No fanfare, no welcome party. Just her tires crunching over loose gravel, the rising smell of pine and damp soil, and the hum of insects in the background. The cabin itself sat at the valley's narrowest bend, with a slope of young cedar on one side and a wide flat of grassland that swept down into a clear stream on the other. The building was old but sturdy, weather-worn planks, a front porch sagging slightly in one corner, and a wind vane that creaked whenever a breeze moved through the gap between trees. It was exactly the kind of place designed for solitude and resilience. She spent the first few days settling in, not in the cozy fireside sort of way, but in the way of someone preparing for a long-term occupation. She took inventory of the tools her uncle had left behind, checked the condition of the root cellar, reinforced the perimeter fencing, and marked key locations on both her GPS and in a physical field notebook. She knew better than to rely on batteries in a place like this. The locals, or at least the few she encountered at the supply store 30 miles away, were polite but distant. No one recognized her last name. When she mentioned the valley, their expressions shifted ever so slightly. A flash of surprise, followed by vague remarks like, "Didn't think anyone was still up there," or "Used to be a walking trail back in the day." But no one said anything that raised flags, so she chalked it up to the typical wariness rural communities had toward outsiders. It wasn't until the 5th evening that something shifted. The sun was beginning to settle, casting golden stripes through the canopy and painting the western edge of the hills in a pale orange. Abigail had just finished restoring one of the old fence gates near the North Trail, an area clearly within her property line according to the GIS overlay, when she noticed a woman standing just beyond the tree line. She wore a pale blue windbreaker, khaki capris, and held a plastic clipboard, the kind used by surveyors or municipal staff. Her expression wasn't hostile, just oddly certain, like someone checking on something they already believed to be true. Abigail approached with calm, purposeful steps. The woman didn't move. When they were a few yards apart, Abigail gave a polite nod. "Can I help you?" The woman looked at her clipboard, then at Abigail, then at the cabin in the distance. "You're the one staying here now?" she asked, her tone half curious, half suspicious. Abigail replied evenly. "I own the land, yes. Just moved in last week." A beat passed. The woman exhaled lightly, her posture stiffening. This land used to be open access. People hiked here. Kids camped down by the creek every summer. That was the way it was. Abigail didn't flinch. It's private property. It always has been. The deed goes back 3 generations, and there's no public easement recorded anywhere. The woman didn't argue. She simply nodded once, tight-lipped. Right. Well, some of us have been using this valley longer than that deed's been sitting in a file cabinet. Just so you know. And then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the tree line, disappearing as quietly as she'd arrived. That night, Abigail stayed up later than usual. Not because she was afraid, she didn't scare easily, but because the encounter didn't sit right. It wasn't just the woman's tone or words, it was the implication. The quiet suggestion that she, the lawful owner of the land, was somehow trespassing on a community tradition, one she had never been made aware of. She reread the boundary surveys, cross-checked old forestry maps, and even dug through the historical records her uncle had left behind. Nowhere was there any record of public trails, informal access agreements, or old right-of-way handshakes with neighbors. It wasn't arrogance that pushed her to hold her ground. It was the simple fact that facts mattered. Still, she started locking the cabin door at night, something she hadn't thought necessary the first few days. 2 mornings later, it escalated. She woke to the sound of gravel shifting under tires. Outside her front porch, 2 county sheriff's vehicles were parked in parallel, engines humming low. She stepped outside, boots crunching lightly on the steps, arms crossed in practiced calm. The older of the 2 deputies gave a polite nod, one hand resting casually near his belt. "Ma'am, we received a call about someone illegally occupying state recreational land. Figured we'd come check it out." Abigail kept her voice steady. "This land is privately owned." "I have the documents inside if you'd like to see them." The deputy glanced at his partner, who gave a small shrug, and then nodded. "Appreciate it." Back inside, she produced the title, Deed, Survey Maps, the recorded transfer documents, and even a notarized copy of the land's classification from the county zoning office. The deputy looked them over without rushing, then made a quiet noise in his throat. Satisfaction, maybe, or resignation. "Everything checks out. Sorry for the disturbance." She nodded once, not smiling. "Can I ask who filed the report?" The deputy hesitated, then said plainly, "A resident named Karen Bronson. Said this area was a conservation site and that someone had broken into a historical structure." Abigail blinked. "This is a modern cabin, built in the late 70s. There's nothing historical about it." The deputy smiled thinly. "Didn't think so, but procedure's procedure." And, just like that, they left. As their vehicles rumbled away, Abigail stood alone in the morning chill, the silence of the valley settling back around her like a second skin. But it no longer felt like sanctuary. It felt like a field under pressure, wide open but waiting to crack. Karen Bronson wasn't just a neighbor with an attitude. She was someone who believed she had the moral high ground, and those were the most dangerous kind. They didn't care what the law said. They only cared about what felt like it should be true. And now Abigail knew for certain. She hadn't just inherited land. She had inherited a quiet war. Abigail didn't sleep much the night after the deputies left. Something had changed. Not in the landscape, which remained just as still and majestic as ever, but in the atmosphere. The way one can feel a storm long before it's visible on the horizon. The illusion of solitude was broken. She wasn't just being watched, she was being catalogued, judged, framed as an intruder on her own land. Over the following days, she noticed small changes that at first seemed benign but gradually grew more deliberate. A wooden marker had been planted just beyond the stream to the east, painted in green with the words, "Open Access Corridor," written in careful block letters. She hadn't placed it there, and it certainly hadn't been there during her initial walkthrough. A few days later, she found another stake, this one with a laminated flyer attached to it. The paper was curled from the morning dew, but still legible. Wildland Preservation Walk, Saturday. Meet at Old Creek Crossing. There was no organizer listed, no official header, just a phone number scribbled in pen at the bottom. She didn't call it. Instead, Abigail returned to her documentation, printing out larger versions of the land survey overlays and marking where these new intrusions were taking place. Each one fell well within the boundaries of her private parcel. She recorded dates, GPS coordinates, and photos of every marker and flyer. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparedness. She'd dealt with informal land use disputes before, cases where long-term, unofficial access bred entitlement, but it was different when it was personal, when the trespasser wasn't just some hiker or local teen, but an adult, organized and methodical. And it wasn't just Karen anymore. One morning, while checking the perimeter near the north pasture, Abigail found signs of trampling, a path of freshly broken ferns, scattered boot prints, and an old campfire ring that hadn't been there before. Charcoal fragments, a crumpled beer can, and a plastic bag with apple cores. Someone had set up camp. Temporary, unannounced, and utterly illegal. Rather than confronting anyone directly, Abigail filed a formal trespass notice with the county sheriff's department. She included digital maps, annotated photos, a signed affidavit confirming her legal status as sole property holder, and GPS-tagged timestamps for each incident. The sheriff's office acknowledged receipt and added her case to the log, but she sensed reluctance in their tone. "We'll keep an eye on it," the deputy said on the phone. "Hard to police these out-of-the-way places. Sometimes folks just don't know where the lines are." But Abigail knew that was no longer the truth. The signs weren't accidental. They were strategic. A creeping narrative was forming. One where her ownership was inconvenient, perhaps even seen as illegitimate, no matter the documents she held. That Saturday, true to the flyer's promise, the intrusions escalated. At precisely 10:30 in the morning, a group of nearly a dozen people appeared along the gravel access trail leading from the south, carrying walking sticks, backpacks, and thermoses, dressed in layers of breathable outdoor wear. Some wore matching hats with a printed emblem she didn't recognize, while others carried clipboards and what looked like birding guides. Karen was among them, of course, leading the way with a long aluminum pointer she used to gesture toward various parts of the landscape as if she were a docent at a historical site. Abigail didn't approach. She stood on her porch, arms folded, watching as the group made their way to the stream bank, took photos, made notes, and began what looked like an informal lecture on local flora. No one came to the cabin. No one acknowledged her. At 1:04 p.m., two of the hikers wandered closer to her property's central trailhead, where Abigail had posted clear, "Private property, no trespassing" signs. She waited. When they crossed the boundary, she stepped off the porch and called out, voice sharp but even. "That's far enough." One of the hikers turned, clearly startled. The other, a younger man with a gray beard and reflective sunglasses, stared at her in silence before calling back. "We're just following the old trail. Been here since before you were." Abigail didn't raise her voice. "It's not an old trail. It's my land, and you're trespassing." Karen, who had been mid-discussion near the stream, turned abruptly and strode up the slope. "There's no need to make a scene," she said with performative calm. "This land was used for educational access for decades. You can't just shut it down because you've got a piece of paper." Abigail's pulse didn't spike. She was too practiced for that. "The piece of paper is called a title deed, Karen." "The law is on my side. Leave now." Karen turned to the others. "Let's move on, folks. Some people just aren't community-minded." The group began to retreat. Not quickly, not apologetically, but with the languid confidence of people who believed they would be back. By late afternoon, they were gone. Abigail took more photos, updated her log, and contacted her attorney in the city, a land rights specialist named Marcus Grant, who she'd worked with on several conservation projects. She explained the situation. He didn't sound surprised. "This happens more often than you think," he said. "If they try to establish historical use or easement by prescription, it could get complicated, especially if they're claiming open access over many years. But your documentation's strong. Keep it that way. Keep recording. Don't escalate." That night, Abigail drafted a certified cease and desist letter, addressed not just to Karen Bronson, but to all unnamed parties acting under implied permission or assumption of public access. She sent it to Marcus for review. He promised to send a notarized version with delivery tracking to every property owner bordering her land. The following morning, things took an uglier turn. Someone had opened the main gate near the northern edge of the valley, a gate that Abigail kept padlocked. The chain was still there, but the lock had been cut clean through, and lying nearby was a bolt cutter, rusted and worn. A trail of tire marks led onto her land, wide, heavy treads that didn't match any of her equipment. She followed them on foot, armed this time with a sidearm and a radio just in case. They led halfway into a meadow before turning and disappearing into the trees. Along the route, she noticed pink surveyor's tape tied to a cluster of saplings. Not her tape, and not there the day before. That night, she received a call, not from the sheriff, not from Marcus, but from the local utility cooperative. A man named Ray with a clipped, apologetic voice. "Ma'am, we had a request submitted under your parcel number for future utility review. Water access and rural broadband eligibility." Abigail blinked. "I didn't submit anything." Ray was quiet for a moment. "That's what I thought. But someone used a very old property grid with your parcel ID and an attached request for access feasibility. It's been flagged. Just wanted to let you know." Abigail didn't need a translator to know what was happening. Someone was trying to establish a paper trail, an alternate version of land history through small, quiet moves. Trail groups, community walks, fake utility inquiries, and symbolic presence. Not overt theft, just erosion. Wearing away her legitimacy inch by inch until she was the one who seemed like the outsider, the disruptor of a tradition that had never legally existed. She stood on her porch again that night, watching the dark treetops shift in the wind, wondering not whether she was safe, because she was well prepared, but whether she was now engaged in a conflict that would require her to defend the very idea of ownership in a place where memory seemed to matter more than fact. And though she didn't know it yet, the call that came the next morning would push everything past the point of slow erosion, because when she heard the dispatcher's voice on the line, asking if she was the woman occupying the Bronson Trail area without a public use permit, Abigail knew this was no longer posturing. Karen had officially escalated, and this valley, quiet as it was, had just become a battlefield. The dispatcher's phrasing struck Abigail immediately, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. Public use permit was language reserved for trail maintenance crews, temporary scientific surveys, or school-led ecology groups. It was the kind of bureaucratic terminology that didn't just appear organically. Someone had introduced it into the system. Someone who understood how to manipulate official language to cast her presence as an administrative violation instead of what it was: legal residency on privately held land. Abigail kept her voice calm, measured. She explained again that she was the sole deeded owner of the valley, that the land was not designated for public access, that no permit process applied to her because no jurisdiction demanded it. The dispatcher, professional but clearly uninterested in debate, promised to forward her response. No apology, no correction, just protocol. She hung up and immediately contacted Marcus, who responded within an hour with a formal cease and desist affidavit ready to be delivered to the county offices, demanding immediate retraction of any public use claims and warning of civil action if her property was referenced in further unauthorized municipal language. But legal steps, even swift ones, moved slower than rumor and intent. By the following week, Abigail began encountering new trespassers. Not coordinated hikers this time, but pairs and individuals, middle-aged couples with digital cameras and plastic water bottles, college-aged kids and trail runners, even a retired-looking man walking a border collie off-leash. She spoke to 3 of them. Each insisted they were following what they thought was a community trail. One even pointed to an old smartphone map that labeled the area as Bronson Loop, Public Overlook Access. Abigail asked to see it. The map wasn't official, just a user-submitted layer on a third-party app. She took a photo and added it to her evidence log, but the realization burned deeper than simple annoyance. Karen had gone digital. The myth of open access was now being replicated, scaled, and spread through the most powerful distribution method available: perception. Abigail knew she had to act before the informal became precedent. She called Marcus again, this time with a sharper edge in her voice. "They're redefining the land in real time," she said. "Digitally, symbolically. If this gets embedded, no amount of documentation will matter." Marcus agreed. He arranged for a licensed surveyor to visit the property and formally remark all boundary lines with tamper-evident, GPS-stamped signage. The signs were aluminum, anchored into the ground with steel bolts, and each one included a unique verification number linked to a state-recognized survey certificate. It wasn't about intimidation. It was about legal permanence. The act of marking the land wasn't symbolic. It was protective. The surveyor's team arrived discreetly and worked over the course of 2 days, mapping, flagging, documenting. On the morning of the 3rd day, while Abigail accompanied them along the eastern ridgeline, a blue Subaru Outback pulled up near the lower trail entrance. Karen stepped out, alone this time, wearing sunglasses, a visor, and a bright yellow vest that read, "Watershed Volunteer, Stewardship Team." She approached without hesitation, clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said, her tone full of brittle authority. "Do you have a permit for this operation?" Abigail didn't look at her immediately. She handed the signed survey orders to the team leader and then turned, arms at her sides. "It's a private land survey. State certified. You're trespassing." Karen's smile was professional, hollow. "This area includes a section of critical watershed. Any major soil disruption requires notification to the Conservation District." Abigail didn't blink. "There is no soil disruption. We're placing boundary markers. On my land." Karen glanced at the metal post now gleaming in the sunlight, then at the technician securing it to the ground. "We'll see what the district says about that," she muttered, before turning and walking briskly back to her car. By dusk, Abigail received an email from a regional field officer with the Conservation District, informing her that a complaint had been lodged regarding unauthorized installation of permanent fixtures within the ecologically sensitive corridor known as Bronson Hollow. There was no such designation in any legal or conservation record. The name had been fabricated, slipped into discourse through repetition until even agencies began to accept it. Abigail replied immediately, attaching her deed, the surveyor's credentials, and a formal demand for removal of the fabricated regional nomenclature from any public or semi-public documentation. She CC'd Marcus, who followed up with a threat of litigation for libel and attempted obstruction of landholder rights. But while the legal machine churned, events on the ground moved faster. 2 days later, Abigail discovered that 6 of her newly installed markers had been removed. 3 of them ripped entirely from the ground, their bases left twisted and mangled. Nearby, she found pieces of bolt caps scattered like shrapnel and a muddy footprint pressed deep into the edge of a game trail. She contacted the sheriff's office immediately, filed a report, and demanded a formal investigation into vandalism and property destruction. A deputy was dispatched within the hour, and Abigail walked him through the perimeter. He took notes, snapped photos, nodded soberly, but said what she already feared. Hard to prove who did it unless you catch them in the act. She offered to show her security footage. The deputy hesitated, then said carefully, "Even if someone's caught, enforcement's tricky out here." These kinds of disputes turn into neighbor wars. No one wants to press too hard. Abigail didn't argue. She knew the script. Igru knew that rural enforcement depended less on justice and more on preserving equilibrium. That night, she installed motion-activated trail cameras, high-definition, infrared, low-profile units placed strategically across the valley. She didn't tell anyone, didn't even inform Marcus. It wasn't about catching someone. It was about visibility, pattern recognition, understanding the rhythm of intrusion. Over the next week, she reviewed footage nightly. Most of it was wildlife, deer, raccoons, a lone fox. But 3 nights in, at 3:17 a.m., one of the northern units captured a figure moving along the fence line. Medium height, hooded jacket, bolt cutters in one hand. The person stopped, looked directly at the camera, then turned and vanished into the trees. Abigail didn't share the footage with law enforcement. Not yet. She stored it, time-stamped and tagged. A message without context could be dismissed. But patterns couldn't. As the legal proceedings advanced, Marcus discovered something else. An archived subdivision proposal from the early 2000s that had included a speculative access trail through the western edge of what was now Abigail's property. The proposal had been rejected. No roads built, no permissions granted. But the map still existed in one of the county's planning records. Karen, or someone close to her, had begun referencing this obsolete proposal as justification for informal trail access, arguing that the valley had been intended for development before Abigail closed it off. Marcus filed a takedown request and a correction demand, but the narrative had taken root. Articles began to appear in local newsletters, anonymous op-eds lamenting the privatization of natural heritage, gatekeeping of common resources, and outsider ownership overriding local tradition. Abigail read each piece carefully, highlighting language, cross-referencing terms. None named her directly, but they didn't have to. The image they painted was clear. A stranger hoarding land, fencing off beauty, silencing a legacy. The most effective kind of fiction, built not from lies but from selective truth. She responded only once in the form of a public statement issued through Marcus's office, laying out her legal standing, her conservation intentions, and a clear warning that further defamation would be met with formal challenge. But she knew it wouldn't be enough, because the battle had shifted. It wasn't just about trails or access anymore. It was about identity, about who had the right to belong. And in the court of public perception, land titles meant far less than stories people had told themselves for years. When the first anonymous package arrived, a manila envelope left at her gate containing a single printed message. "You don't belong here, city girl." Abigail didn't report it. She scanned it, logged it, stored it. It was crude, unoriginal, but it confirmed what she'd already concluded. The next move wouldn't be symbolic. It would be direct. The escalation had begun, and it would not be reversed by polite conversation or patient evidence. The valley was hers by law, but she was about to find out whether it would remain hers by will. And Karen, quiet, calculating, and determined, was nowhere near finished. Abigail had always understood the importance of documentation, how facts, when structured correctly, could become a shield. But as the campaign against her presence deepened, she began to understand another truth, that facts could also become targets. A week after receiving the anonymous envelope, she discovered that her mailbox had been pried open and emptied. Nothing official had been delivered, but the lock was broken, hinges bent as if tested for resistance. 2 days later, one of her trail cameras went offline. When she retrieved it, the casing was split cleanly across the middle, wires exposed, the memory card removed. It wasn't vandalism for sport. It was a strategic dismantling of her surveillance network, a slow erasure of her capacity to bear witness. Marcus responded with swift escalation. He filed a formal complaint with the Sheriff's Department citing targeted harassment, destruction of property, and threats of intimidation. He also initiated proceedings for an injunction, a restraining order that would prevent Karen and any of her known associates from entering or organizing activity within 300 feet of Abigail's property line. The county, under pressure from mounting legal paperwork and mounting public friction, scheduled a hearing within 10 business days. It was faster than usual, but not fast enough. In those 10 days, the entire landscape of conflict shifted. On the 4th night after the injunction filing, Abigail was woken at 2:11 a.m. by the distant sound of a vehicle engine. Not the soft roll of tires on gravel, but the low, deliberate hum of something heavier. An ATV or perhaps an off-road utility vehicle. She rose silently, moved to the back window, and spotted faint lights moving through the far end of the pasture. Not headlights, but the bouncing glow of flash-mounted headlamps, jerking left to right in slow arcs. She dressed in under a minute, laced her boots, and grabbed her flashlight and compact radio. Her weapon stayed holstered. She wasn't going out to confront, only to observe. She circled wide, using the old irrigation trench for cover, and moved through the brush until she had a clear vantage of the lower ridge. There, in the clearing, were 2 men in reflective gear, pacing in careful lines, measuring something, placing markers, bright pink flags that she recognized instantly from her previous encounters. One of them knelt and drove a stake into the ground with a small sledgehammer. They were mapping. Not trails, not campsites. Boundaries. It wasn't a trespass. It was an unofficial survey, being carried out in the dead of night, likely with the intention of creating the illusion of a disputed border. Abigail didn't confront them. Instead, she marked their location, took time-stamped photos with her long-lens camera, and recorded 10 minutes of footage from a concealed angle. When she returned to the cabin, she transferred all files to a portable drive and sent an encrypted copy to Marcus, labeled Night Survey, Eastern Meadow. His reply came before dawn. This is actionable. We go public at the hearing. But Abigail was beginning to understand that the courtroom wasn't the only battleground. The following afternoon, she received a knock at her front door. Rare, almost unheard of. Standing there was a man in his 60s, thin, tall, with sun-leathered skin and wire-frame glasses. He introduced himself as Richard Elwell, a retired geologist who lived 2 miles south. He didn't smile. "You don't know me, but I know what's happening," he said. Abigail didn't invite him in, but she stepped out onto the porch. He continued, his voice low, steady. "Karen tried something similar 5 years ago. Different property, smaller scale. She pushes until people sell out or cave, claims historical access, makes enough noise until no one wants to fight. You're the first one to stand firm." Abigail kept her expression neutral. "Why are you telling me this?" He glanced down the trail, then back to her. "Because she's not working alone this time. There's money in play." Developers. People who want access to this valley for more than birdwatching. That caught Abigail's attention, but she didn't respond. Richard sighed. "I'm not asking for anything." Just don't underestimate how far she'll go." Then he left, disappearing down the trail without further explanation. That evening, Abigail revisited her uncle's old records. Among them were outdated maps, some dating back to the 1980s, hand-drawn overlays showing proposed roads, utility corridors, even soil viability reports. One document stood out: a rejected proposal for a rural airstrip, placed exactly where Karen's so-called community trail now ran. The application had been denied due to ecological concerns and lack of easement, but the document bore a name: David Bronson, Karen's late husband. Abigail sat back, realization blooming slowly. This wasn't just about access or tradition. This was about legacy, about reclaiming a failed dream through revisionist pressure. Karen wasn't fighting for nature. She was fighting for a name. When the hearing finally arrived, Abigail and Marcus presented a mountain of evidence: property maps, timestamps, surveillance footage, the anonymous letter, the destroyed camera, and, most importantly, the nighttime mapping operation. Karen's legal counsel, clearly caught off guard, attempted to argue that community use constituted implied easement, but the judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and little tolerance for ambiguity, dismissed the argument flatly. Implied easement cannot be manufactured through trespass or organized pressure. That is harassment, not tradition. The injunction was granted. Karen and her affiliates were barred from the property line. Any future public claims about access would be treated as defamation. The courtroom was still, quiet, tense with unspoken resentment. Karen said nothing, but her glare toward Abigail was heavy with warning. As they exited, Marcus leaned in and whispered, "We won the round, not the war." And Abigail knew he was right, because a name once denied, Bronson, was now stitched into maps, whispered through digital channels, fed into hiking apps and social groups like Folklore. Karen might have lost the case, but she had already poisoned the story. The valley would never be anonymous again, and its true owner would have to defend it, not just in court, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who believed that stories mattered more than deeds. The temporary legal victory did little to change the atmosphere surrounding Abigail's claim to the valley. If anything, the injunction acted as a catalyst. The silence that followed the hearing wasn't peace. It was recalibration. Karen disappeared from view for several days, but Abigail sensed her presence in the way someone senses electrical current through a wall. Unseen, yet undeniable. There were no more hikers, no more flyers, and none of the ostentatious intrusions that had defined the earlier phase of resistance. But then, one morning, Abigail awoke to a sound that didn't belong. It was subtle at first, a high-pitched mechanical whine drifting through the trees from somewhere south. Not the sound of engines or chainsaws, but something lower, more rhythmic. She dressed quickly, grabbed her binoculars, and headed uphill toward the western overlook. From there, she could see the narrowest bend of the access road, and beside it, half obscured by pine trunks, was a small crew erecting what appeared to be a temporary structure. Scaffolding, orange fencing, a work tent. It wasn't on her land, not directly, but it was within 100 feet of her boundary. She called Marcus immediately. He pulled up the county permit board, cross-referenced utility work schedules, and found nothing. No authorized projects. No requests for infrastructure improvements. Nothing. Abigail returned to the overlook with her long lens and began photographing every detail. Truck license plates, equipment labels, even the workers' uniforms. Most had no logos, no identifiers. But one man wore a vest with a half-peeled patch on the back, just enough to make out the faded acronym of a land development firm that had folded over a decade ago. By the next day, the tent had doubled in size, and 2 additional vehicles had arrived. The operation had a makeshift generator, sealed barrels, and what looked like soil sampling equipment. Abigail, no stranger to ecological procedures, knew what she was seeing. Preliminary geotech surveying. It wasn't random. It was preparation. Marcus advised restraint. Don't approach. Don't confront. We file a cease and demand disclosure of their project scope. If they're encroaching, we catch them with paper. So Abigail waited. But while she held back from direct confrontation, she didn't remain passive. She pulled every archived transaction involving land within a 2-mile radius. The findings were unsettling. Over the past 8 months, multiple parcels, wooded, irregular, otherwise unattractive to ordinary buyers, had been purchased by a shell company with a Denver address. Each sale had been cash-based, each recorded under varying LLC names. But the paperwork linked back to a single administrative agent, Kara D. Bronson. Karen hadn't just been organizing hikes and spreading myths, she had been assembling a perimeter. The development near her property wasn't about access. It was a pincer move. Test the border, document the terrain, and then reintroduce the narrative. This was land once meant for public good, now locked away by a lone outsider. A few days later, her suspicions were confirmed when a glossy brochure arrived in her mail. No return address. On the cover, a stylized aerial image of the valley with a proposed trail overlay. Inside, words like ecotourism, accessible nature, and heritage renewal danced between stock photos of smiling hikers and wildflowers. It was a sales pitch, slick, professional, and deeply manipulative. The map featured a loop that didn't just graze her land. It cut through it. There was even a fictitious rest stop labeled Horton Lookout. Her name, her space, hijacked into someone else's narrative. Abigail scanned every page, sent it to Marcus, and then made a decision. She wouldn't just react, she would assert. Within 48 hours, she filed her own land use declaration with the county, establishing the valley as a private ecological reserve under her stewardship. The filing didn't give her new rights, it simply made public what was already true. But the act of formalizing it triggered automatic notices to all neighboring parcels and added her property to the county's conservation registry. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of building a wall. She also hired a private environmental consultant to conduct a full biodiversity audit, complete with drone imaging, habitat assessments, and water purity reports. The results would serve both as protective data and public proof of the land's value in its untouched state. Karen responded with escalation. A week later, Abigail received a legal notice from a newly formed nonprofit called Friends of Bronson Hollow, claiming historical and cultural interest in the area. The letter was worded carefully, but the intent was clear. They demanded she honor community tradition by permitting seasonal access along established routes for non-invasive public benefit. Abigail forwarded the letter to Marcus, who prepared a counter notice within hours. But this time, the dispute didn't stay in legal lanes. Local media picked up the story, publishing a soft focus piece titled "The Valley That Divided a Town." It featured quotes from anonymous residents lamenting the loss of shared space and the gentrification of wild land. Abigail was never named, but her silhouette appeared in a background photo, a distant figure on a hill, framed as the antagonist in someone else's myth. It wasn't just narrative warfare. Subtle sabotage returned. Her water pump, carefully maintained and recently serviced, failed one morning. The technician she called found sugar poured into the intake valve. A trail camera was discovered turned backward, lens smashed, card missing. Her south boundary marker was uprooted and replaced with a fake wooden post bearing the logo of the Bronson nonprofit. Each incident was small, deniable, and surgically precise. And always Karen stayed absent, insulated by her army of plausible deniability. Abigail documented everything, filed new reports, and pushed forward with her conservation plan. But the isolation was no longer peaceful. It was strategic loneliness. Pressure applied not through confrontation, but by forcing her to fight a shadow. Then came the false report. One rainy morning, a patrol vehicle arrived unannounced. The deputy approached with careful formality, requesting permission to inspect the cabin. When asked why, he cited an anonymous tip, allegations of unlicensed chemical storage on the premises. Abigail laughed, not in amusement, but in disbelief. "You think I'm making meth out here?" she asked, voice flat. The deputy didn't answer. She let him in. He found nothing, of course, but the visit was logged. A search had occurred. A record now existed. It was slow erosion, one drop at a time. Marcus increased legal pressure. He filed a comprehensive cease action against the nonprofit, accusing it of harassment, false claims, and organized trespass. He also filed suit against the shell companies acquiring land around the valley, demanding full disclosure of corporate ties and beneficial ownership. Karen remained silent, her name never appearing directly, but the walls began to close. County officials, wary of litigation, quietly retracted any references to Bronson Hollow from public records. The developer activity near her boundary halted. No more surveys, no more crews. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Abigail didn't celebrate. Silence was often a recalibration, not surrender. She reinforced her property lines again, updated her documentation, and continued her work. She wasn't just defending land anymore. She was preserving memory. Not the kind printed in brochures, but the kind that lived in maps, in legal lines, in data and witness and truth. And she knew. The next move would be final. Because Karen hadn't disappeared. She had simply stepped back. And people like her never let go of legacy without one last attempt to rewrite the ending. The first sign that something irreversible was coming wasn't a confrontation or a lawsuit. It was a silence too precise to be natural. For 3 weeks, Abigail experienced nothing. No mail tampering, no vandalism, no anonymous threats, no rogue hikers. The development tents near her border were dismantled. Karen's nonprofit stopped issuing public statements. Even the local newsletter that had published soft criticisms of Abigail's exclusivity ran a recipe column instead of a community spotlight. But Abigail wasn't fooled. The absence of pressure didn't feel like retreat. It felt like misdirection, the way a predator shifts position before lunging again. Then, on the 22nd morning, she received a certified letter, not from Karen, but from the county registrar's office, informing her that a formal petition had been filed to open a public hearing on the potential designation of Bronson Hollow as a site of cultural significance and historical value, with proposed boundaries that overlapped directly with the heart of her property. Attached to the letter was a 28-page submission filled with fabricated trail history, photographs of groups walking land they had no right to, anecdotal statements from residents about annual festivals that never occurred, and most, shockingly, a scanned page from an old zoning map showing a dashed outline labeled Future Conservation Corridor, drawn by hand with the initials DB in the corner, David Bronson. Abigail sat at her kitchen table for a long time, the letter spread out before her, her coffee cooling untouched. This wasn't a smear or a nuisance anymore. This was a coordinated attempt to rewrite ownership itself. If the petition was accepted and voted on, it could lay the groundwork for forced easement, eminent domain arguments, or, at the very least, a permanent stain on her property's autonomy. The hearings would be open to the public. Karen's voice wouldn't need to be loud. It would be echoed by every manipulated narrative she had spent the last year planting. Abigail called Marcus immediately. He was already reviewing the documents. "They're trying to build a new legal reality," And the fact that the county is entertaining the petition means someone inside is sympathetic or scared. We don't respond, yet. We investigate. While Marcus began dissecting the petition for inconsistencies and unlawful submissions, Abigail focused on the part of the fight she could control: information. She traveled to the regional records office, spending 2 days sifting through zoning maps, land use reports, and development proposals from the 1970s to the present. It was there, buried in a dusty file box miscategorized under abandoned civic projects, that she found the proof she needed. A memo from 1989, written by the county zoning board, explicitly rejecting David Bronson's trail proposal due to lack of public benefit and potential ecological disruption. The document contained photographs, testimony from conservationists, and a stamped conclusion. Proposal denied. No public easement permitted. She scanned it, photographed it, and immediately sent copies to Marcus. With this ammunition, Marcus filed an emergency objection to the petition, citing fraud, manipulation of public records, and defamation. But the hearing had already been scheduled, and the petition had gained momentum. Dozens of community members had submitted statements of support, many likely misled, but their words were now part of the record. The hearing took place in the county administration building, a plain, beige structure with a room too small for the number of people who showed up. Karen was there, flanked by 3 board members from her nonprofit and a hired consultant who claimed expertise in rural land legacy disputes. Abigail sat with Marcus near the front, her documentation stacked neatly in a black leather case. When the moderator called the session to order, the tone was oddly ceremonial, as though the fate of her valley was a question of preference, not legality. Karen spoke first, her voice rehearsed, smooth. She painted the valley not as stolen land, but as forgotten inheritance, an ecological sanctuary that had been quietly nurtured by generations of locals, now in danger of permanent loss. She referenced her late husband's dreams, called Abigail an unfortunate symptom of an era of privatization, and appealed to emotion with stories of children learning to fish in streams that were, by every legal measure, private. Abigail said nothing, waiting for her turn. When it came, Marcus stood and spoke with the sharpness of a man who knew the weight of precedent. He presented the zoning memo from 1989, read its concluding statement aloud, and then displayed a blown-up version of the fake zoning map from the petition submission. He showed how the map had been altered, citing the ink composition, mismatched document typeface, and the fraudulent use of an initial. The room shifted. People stirred. Some whispered. The moderator leaned forward, visibly uncomfortable. Abigail stood next. She didn't try to inspire. She simply read aloud the county's own property definition, the conservation results she'd filed, the vandalism reports, and then finished by holding up the false brochure that had used her name without permission. "This isn't about access," she said quietly. "It's about control. Someone lost a bid for this valley 30 years ago, and now they're trying to reclaim it through folklore and intimidation." The room went still. The board adjourned for deliberation. It took less than an hour. When they returned, the lead official announced that the petition was rejected in full. The designation would not be pursued. The zoning map would be corrected, and an inquiry into the submission's origin would be launched. Karen remained motionless, lips pressed thin. She didn't speak. She didn't look at Abigail. She stood and left the room as soon as the ruling was final, followed by her consultants and one of the nonprofit members. The others stayed behind, avoiding eye contact. Outside the building, as Abigail and Marcus stepped into the sharp afternoon light, an older woman from the crowd approached. She didn't introduce herself, but she handed Abigail a folded piece of paper and said, "I believed her, until today. You should know that some of us get it now." Inside, the note was a contact number and a list of names, local residents who had submitted support for the petition and now wished to formally retract. It wasn't victory Abigail felt. It was clarity. The land was hers by right, but the truth had to be fought for, not simply inherited. Karen had lost not because Abigail was louder or more connected, but because facts, once assembled properly, had weight that even a myth couldn't displace. The war wasn't over, but the turning point had come, and the valley, for the first time since her arrival, felt like it was breathing on her side. The weeks that followed the hearing were not celebratory. Abigail didn't uncork anything, didn't post statements, didn't reach out to the locals who had reversed their support, or those who had remained silent. She returned to her routines with a kind of deliberate quiet, restoring fence lines, walking the perimeter before dawn, checking and double-checking her cameras and equipment. The valley had changed her, not in a cinematic sense, not with grand realizations or softened edges, but with an inward resilience that couldn't be borrowed or taught. She no longer waited for the other shoe to drop, because she understood that people like Karen didn't stop out of defeat. They stopped when the cost of pushing further outweighed the satisfaction of control. It wasn't pride that kept Abigail rooted. It was responsibility, not just to her deed or her name, but to the land itself. What had started as an inheritance had become a mantle. Karen didn't vanish entirely. Her nonprofit remained registered, but dormant. Occasionally, Abigail noticed her name mentioned in newsletters, mostly in reference to unrelated projects or planning meetings she no longer attended. Her allies scattered, a few clinging to the myth of a stolen public trail, but most simply redirecting their energy elsewhere. The county never pursued the zoning map forgery publicly, but Marcus informed Abigail that internal disciplinary hearings were underway for at least one staffer who had facilitated the petition's review. That was enough. She didn't need public punishment. She needed precedent. The record now bore the truth, and the narrative had shifted. She hadn't just defended herself. She had forced the county to choose between legal clarity and nostalgic fiction, and for once, the law had won. Spring returned with a kind of gentleness Abigail hadn't felt the year before. The meltwater came earlier, the grass rose faster, and the animals returned in greater numbers. Her field survey, now in its second phase, confirmed the presence of a rare owl species previously thought absent from the region. The environmental report, co-authored by the consulting biologist she had hired months earlier, became a reference point for other landowners interested in conservation status. It brought no fanfare, but it brought protection. Firm, indisputable, recorded protection. Occasionally, she'd see hikers stop at the newly reinforced boundary signs, study the metal plates, then turn back without crossing. Some looked disappointed. A few took photos. None attempted to push through. Once, at the edge of the North Trail, a young couple waved when they saw her. They didn't shout, didn't ask questions, didn't pretend ignorance. They simply acknowledged her presence, then turned and walked away. That, she realized, was the future she had secured. Not isolation, not dominance, but a boundary that held because it had been earned, not just declared. She thought often of her uncle in those last quiet weeks, of how he must have felt maintaining this space alone for decades, never fully trusted, never fully disturbed. She'd found no journals, no letters, only land, and that, in the end, had been the only message he intended to leave. Now it was hers to carry forward, not as a grudge, but as a structure, as something real. One morning in early May, a different car pulled up near the lower trail. Not a hiker, a county vehicle. A single deputy stepped out, not the ones from earlier calls, but a younger man with calm eyes and a notebook. He approached slowly, politely. "Ms. Horton?" She nodded. I wanted to tell you that the zoning board's internal review wrapped. No charges, but the maps officially purged, and—" He hesitated. Off the record, I read the hearing transcript. "You did good. They just don't say that to folks like you. But you did." Abigail didn't reply immediately. She looked past him at the trees, the rise of the hill where the old lookout used to be. Then she nodded once. "Thank you for telling me." When he left, she didn't go inside. She stood in the middle of her field, listening to the wind come down off the ridgeline, the distant stream tracing its old, unbroken path through the earth. No one else was there. No cameras, no watchers, no audience. Just the land. And her. Finally, alone in the valley that she no longer had to defend, because now it defended her.